The water tower still stands above the jungle canopy, rusted now but still bearing the name that once meant progress and prosperity across the world. F-O-R-D. Below it, the Brazilian rainforest has reclaimed what American ambition tried to build. Vines crawling through broken windows, trees pushing through concrete foundations. The humid air slowly dissolving what remains of Henry Ford's most audacious dream. The houses that were built to American specifications still line streets laid out in American grids, but the paint has peeled and the roofs have collapsed, and the families that were supposed to live here, raising children and tapping rubber trees and building a new civilization in the Amazon, never came. Or they came and then they fled, driven out by disease and riot and the fundamental impossibility of what Ford was trying to do. Fordlandia sits on the banks of the Tapajos River, a tributary of the Amazon, approximately 600 miles from the Atlantic Ocean and a world away from everything Henry Ford understood. The town was built to supply rubber for Ford automobile tires, to free the company from dependence on British-controlled rubber plantations in Southeast Asia, to prove that American industrial methods could tame the jungle and extract its resources with the same efficiency that had made the Model T the most successful product in manufacturing history. It failed. It failed completely, catastrophically, and expensively. $20 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, was poured into the Brazilian jungle and produced almost nothing. The rubber trees that were supposed to make Ford independent instead demonstrated the limits of industrial thinking when applied to biological systems. The workers who were supposed to be grateful for American wages and American values instead rioted against American rules. The jungle that was supposed to be conquered instead conquered everything Ford tried to build. Today, Fordlandia is a ghost town, home to a few thousand Brazilians who live among the ruins of American ambition, who use the hospital Ford built and send their children to schools in buildings Ford constructed, who have made a life in the wreckage of someone else's failed dream. The rubber plantation that was supposed to cover the hills with orderly rows of productive trees is now indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. The industrial facilities that were supposed to process latex into exportable rubber stand empty, their machinery rusted into immobility. The American dream that Henry Ford tried to plant in the Amazon has become a monument to hubris, a reminder that not everything can be engineered, that some problems cannot be solved by applying more money and more willpower and more certainty that you know better than the people who actually live there. How did the richest industrialist in America come to build a town in the Brazilian jungle? What made Henry Ford believe he could succeed where rubber cultivation had failed for decades? What happened to the workers and managers and families who tried to make Fordlandia work? And what does the ruin of this American experiment tell us about the limits of industrial ambition and the costs of cultural arrogance? This is the story of Fordlandia, Henry Ford's jungle nightmare, the American town that the Amazon destroyed, and the lessons that the richest man in the world paid $20 million to learn. If you find value in investigations of American ambition and failure, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which forgotten story to explore next. Your engagement makes these detailed investigations possible. Thank you for being here. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the jungle, before the riots, before Fordlandia became a synonym for American overreach, Henry Ford in the 1920s was not just a businessman. He was an icon, perhaps the most famous industrialist in the world, a man whose name was synonymous with modern manufacturing and American success. The Ford Motor Company had revolutionized not just the automobile industry, but the very concept of mass production. The assembly line techniques pioneered at Ford's Highland Park and River Rouge plants had transformed manufacturing across every industry, making products cheaper and more accessible than ever before in human history. Ford himself had become fabulously wealthy, one of the richest men in the world, but he had also become something more, a symbol of what American ingenuity could accomplish. He paid his workers the unheard-of wage of $5 a day, more than double the prevailing rate, and was celebrated as a friend of the working man even as he maintained absolute control over every aspect of his employees' lives. He had taken on the railroad monopolies and won, building his own transportation network to free his company from their control. He seemed to believe that any problem could be solved through the application of rational methods and sufficient resources, and the success of the Model T had given him little reason to doubt that belief. But Ford had a problem that money alone could not solve. His cars ran on rubber tires, and rubber came from places Ford did not control. The rubber tree, Hevea brasiliensis, is native to the Amazon basin, a species that evolved over millions of years in the world's largest rainforest. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of the region had harvested its latex for various purposes: waterproofing baskets, making balls for games, creating containers that could hold water without leaking. The Portuguese colonizers noted these uses but saw little commercial potential in the sticky white sap that oozed from cuts in the bark. That changed in 1839, when Charles Goodyear discovered vulcanization, the process of treating rubber with sulfur and heat to make it durable, elastic, and resistant to temperature changes. Before vulcanization, natural rubber was nearly useless for industrial purposes. It melted in summer heat and cracked in winter cold. After vulcanization, rubber became one of the most versatile materials in the industrial world. It could be used for waterproofing, for machinery belts and hoses, for electrical insulation, for gaskets and seals in engines and pumps, and increasingly it could be used for tires. The Amazon rubber boom of the late 19th century transformed the Brazilian interior. Rubber barons grew fantastically wealthy, building opera houses in the jungle, importing European luxuries to cities accessible only by river, living in opulence that rivaled the aristocracies of the Old World. Manaus, 1,000 miles up the Amazon, built a grand opera house with Italian marble and French chandeliers, hosted European opera companies who traveled weeks to perform, became a symbol of wealth extracted from the jungle by the labor of thousands of rubber tappers working in conditions that amounted to debt slavery. The tappers themselves lived in poverty, bound to their patrons by debts they could never repay, required to sell their rubber at prices the patrons set and buy their supplies at prices the patrons demanded. They worked alone in the jungle, walking circuits through the forest to tend the scattered trees they had claimed, collecting latex in cups attached to each tree, smoking the latex over fires to coagulate it into balls that could be transported to market. It was brutal, lonely, dangerous work, and the wealth it created flowed upward to the barons and outward to the factories of Europe and America that consumed ever-increasing quantities of rubber. The boom could not last. In 1876, an Englishman named Henry Wickham accomplished what would later be called one of the greatest acts of biopiracy in history. Working as a trader in the Amazon, Wickham collected 70,000 rubber tree seeds and smuggled them out of Brazil, delivering them to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in England. From those seeds, the British established rubber plantations in their Southeast Asian colonies, Malaya, Ceylon, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, where the trees could be grown in orderly rows on cleared land, tended by laborers working for wages rather than debt, harvested efficiently by workers who moved from tree to tree along planned routes. The Asian plantations had an enormous advantage over the wild rubber of the Amazon. They were not afflicted by South American leaf blight, the fungal disease that had evolved alongside rubber trees in their native habitat. In the Amazon, the blight limited how closely trees could be planted. If they were too close together, the disease spread rapidly from tree to tree, defoliating and killing whole groves. In Asia, where the blight did not exist, trees could be planted in dense rows, maximizing production per acre and minimizing the labor required for collection. By the 1920s, the British-controlled plantations in Southeast Asia produced over 90% of the world's rubber. The wild rubber of the Amazon, harvested tree by tree from scattered locations in the vast jungle, could not compete with the efficiency of plantation agriculture. The Brazilian rubber industry collapsed. The opera house in Manaus closed. The rubber barons saw their fortunes evaporate. The tappers drifted away to other work or deeper poverty. The jungle reclaimed the stations and trails that had briefly scarred its vastness. This concentration of rubber production in British-controlled territories presented a strategic vulnerability that men like Henry Ford could not ignore. The automobile industry consumed rubber in ever-increasing quantities. not just for tires, but for hoses, belts, gaskets, and dozens of other components. Ford's River Rouge plant, the largest factory in the world, processed thousands of tons of rubber annually, all of it imported from plantations Ford did not control in countries Ford could not influence. The Stephenson Plan of 1922 demonstrated just how vulnerable American manufacturers were. The British colonial government, seeking to support rubber prices that had fallen after World War I, imposed restrictions on rubber exports from Malaya. Prices doubled, then tripled. American manufacturers screamed about British price manipulation, but there was nothing they could do. They needed rubber. The British controlled rubber, and the British could charge whatever the market would bear. Henry Ford's response was characteristic of the man. He would not accept dependence on anyone. He would not tolerate being subject to the whims of foreign governments or the manipulations of commodity speculators. If the British could grow rubber in Southeast Asia, he would grow rubber in South America, where the trees were native and where American investment would be welcome. He would control his own supply as he controlled his own steel and his own glass and his own lumber. He would be dependent on no one. The decision to establish a rubber plantation in Brazil was announced in 1927, and from the beginning it was shaped by Ford's absolute confidence in his own methods and his absolute disregard for the knowledge of others. In 1927, Ford's agents negotiated a concession with the Brazilian government. For a nominal fee and promises of future development, Ford received rights to a tract of land along the Tapajós River, 2.5 million acres, an area larger than the state of Connecticut. The land was covered with virgin rainforest, inhabited by scattered indigenous communities and a few rubber tappers who worked the wild trees. Ford planned to clear the forest, plant rubber trees in orderly rows, build a town for the workers who would tend them, and ship the latex back to Detroit to be made into tires for Ford automobiles. The project was named Fordlandia, and from the beginning it was shaped by Ford's particular vision of how the world should work. The town that rose on the banks of the Tapajós was designed in Michigan by engineers who had never seen the Amazon, who worked from maps and photographs and the reports of advanced scouts who applied the same principles that had made Highland Park and River Rouge successful without understanding that those principles might not translate to a different environment. The houses were built in the American style, with metal roofs that were standard in Michigan but turned the structures into ovens under the tropical sun. The temperature inside these houses during midday could exceed 120 degrees, making them uninhabitable during the hottest hours. Local Brazilian architecture used thatched roofs that breathed, elevated foundations that caught breezes and avoided flooding, screened porches where families could escape the worst of the heat. The American houses had none of these features. They were designed for a climate they would never experience, built for a place their designers had never seen. The streets were laid out in a grid pattern, the same efficient arrangement that organized American cities from New York to Los Angeles. But a grid pattern makes sense where land is flat and drainage is predictable. In the Amazon, where terrain is irregular and rainfall is torrential, a grid pattern meant that some streets flooded repeatedly while others remained dry, that drainage problems plagued the town from its first rainy season, that the rational planning of Michigan created irrational results in Brazil. Fire hydrants were installed at regular intervals along the streets, painted red and standing ready for emergencies. There was no pressurized water system to supply them. The hydrants were decorative, symbols of American civilization with no practical function, monuments to the assumption that the forms of American life could be imported without regard for the infrastructure that made those forms meaningful. A hospital was built, one of the finest medical facilities in the Amazon region, staffed with American doctors and equipped with American technology. This, at least, was useful. The jungle was full of diseases that required modern treatment, and the hospital served not just Fordlandia's workers but the surrounding population for miles around. The hospital remains in operation today, one of the few legacies of Ford's investment that continues to benefit the people who live there. Schools were built with curricula designed to educate workers' children in American style, to prepare them for lives as productive members of an American-style community. Churches were built, Protestant churches in a Catholic country, offering religious services that most workers had no interest in attending. A golf course was laid out because what American community would be complete without a golf course, even if the tropical heat made playing impossible during most of the day, and the jungle reclaimed the fairways faster than groundskeepers could maintain them. Ford's social vision was imposed with the same thoroughness as his physical planning. Workers were required to live in company housing, assigned to homes based on their position in the company hierarchy, forbidden from building their own structures or arranging their own living situations. They were required to eat in company cafeterias where meals were prepared according to American standards, heavy on canned vegetables and processed foods, light on the fresh tropical foods that workers were accustomed to eating. The cafeterias served food on American schedules, breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, without regard for the local custom of taking the main meal at midday and resting during the hottest hours. Workers who were accustomed to a 2-hour lunch break followed by work in the cooler afternoon were expected to work straight through the day, taking only a brief break for a meal they had not chosen at a time they found inconvenient. Alcohol was absolutely prohibited, as it was in Ford's American plants. Ford was a teetotaler who believed that alcohol was the root of most social problems, and he imposed his beliefs on his workers whether they agreed or not. In Brazil, where moderate drinking was a normal part of social life, where beer and cachaça were consumed at celebrations and gatherings without the stigma they carried in America, the prohibition was resented as an imposition of foreign values on people who had not asked for them. Workers were assigned identification badges and required to punch time clocks, their arrivals and departures recorded with the same precision that governed the assembly line in Detroit. They were expected to wear American-style work clothes, to maintain American standards of hygiene, to conduct themselves according to American notions of proper behavior. Inspectors from the company's sociological department, the same organization that monitored workers' lives in Dearborn, visited homes to ensure that families were living according to Ford's standards. The sociological department had been controversial even in America, where its investigators entered workers' homes to check on cleanliness, family stability, and moral character. In Brazil, where the concept was entirely foreign, where workers had no tradition of employer intrusion into private life, the inspections were experienced as violations, as insults, as evidence that the Americans viewed Brazilians as children who needed to be civilized rather than as adults capable of managing their own affairs. The work itself was supposed to be straightforward: clear the jungle, plant rubber trees, tend them until they matured, tap them for latex, process the latex for export. Each step was planned in detail by experts in Michigan who had studied rubber cultivation from books and reports, who had consulted with botanists and agronomists, who had developed systems and schedules that would maximize efficiency and minimize waste. The reality was nothing like the plan. The Brazilians who came to work at Fordlandia were not the grateful recipients of American civilization that Ford had imagined. Many were experienced rubber tappers who understood the jungle far better than the American managers who had been sent to supervise them. They knew that rubber trees grew best in the wild, scattered through the forest where diseases and pests could not spread easily from tree to tree. They knew that the jungle soil, despite its lush vegetation, was poor and acidite, unsuited for the kind of intensive agriculture that Ford envisioned. They knew that the Amazon had its own rules, and that outsiders who ignored those rules paid heavy prices. The Americans who managed Fordlandia did not listen. They had been sent by Henry Ford to implement Henry Ford's vision, and they had neither the authority nor the inclination to deviate from the plan. The forests were cleared with American efficiency, the trees burned or sold for lumber, the land exposed to sun and rain that began immediately to degrade the fragile soil. Rubber seedlings were planted in neat rows, spaced according to calculations made in Michigan, without regard for the conditions they would actually face in the Amazon. The problems began almost immediately. The rubber trees, planted close together in plantation style, became vulnerable to South American leaf blight, a fungal disease endemic to the Amazon that had never been a serious problem when trees grew wild and scattered. In the wild, the disease could not spread easily from tree to tree. In plantation rows, it devastated entire sections, the fungus spreading through the humid air from leaf to leaf until whole groves were defoliated and dying. The American managers tried everything they could think of. They imported disease-resistant varieties from Asia. They experimented with fungicides. They adjusted spacing and pruning techniques. Nothing worked. The leaf blight continued to spread, and the trees that were supposed to produce latex for Ford tires instead produced only more evidence that the plantation model could not succeed in the Amazon. The human problems were equally severe. The workers resented the American rules that governed their lives, the prohibition on alcohol, the requirement to eat unfamiliar food, the rigid schedules that ignored the rhythms of tropical life. They resented the American managers who treated them as interchangeable units of labor, rather than as skilled workers with knowledge worth respecting. They resented the racial hierarchy that placed Americans at the top and Brazilians at the bottom, regardless of competence or experience. In December 1930, the resentment exploded into open revolt. The immediate cause was trivial: a change in the cafeteria service that required workers to wait in line for their food rather than being served at tables. A small indignity that became the final insult after years of accumulated grievances. The riot began in the cafeteria during the evening meal. Workers who had been forced to stand in line, who had been served food they did not want at times they had not chosen, who had been treated as interchangeable units of production rather than as human beings with dignity and preferences, finally broke. They overturned tables. They smashed dishes. They destroyed the serving equipment that symbolized everything they hated about the American system. From the cafeteria, the riot spread. Workers attacked the time clocks, smashing the machines that had recorded their every arrival and departure, that had reduced their work to numbers on a ledger, that had treated their labor as a commodity to be measured and controlled. They destroyed the generators that powered the American equipment. They set fire to buildings that represented American authority. The American managers fled for their lives. They ran to the river, to boats that could carry them away from the violence, abandoning the property they had been sent to protect. Some barely escaped. Workers with machetes chased them through streets they had walked safely for years, the accumulated rage of the workforce finally finding targets for its expression. The managers waited on the river while the riot burned itself out, while the workers vented their fury on the physical symbols of American control. They had no weapons capable of resisting the crowd, no means of restoring order, no choice but to wait for help that might or might not arrive. Brazilian military forces eventually came, soldiers dispatched by a government that had its own interest in maintaining order, in protecting foreign investment, in demonstrating that Brazil was a safe place for international capital. The soldiers restored calm, identified the ringleaders, arrested those deemed most responsible. The riot was officially over, but the riot had revealed truths that no amount of military force could suppress. Fordlandia was not working. The workers were not grateful for American civilization. The methods that had succeeded in Detroit were failing in the Amazon. The confidence that had launched the project was misplaced, and everyone now knew it, except perhaps the one man whose opinion mattered most. Henry Ford responded to the news from Brazil in characteristic fashion. He refused to accept failure. If the original site was unsuitable, he would find a better one. If the workers were ungrateful, he would find better workers. If the methods had not succeeded, it was because they had not been applied with sufficient rigor, not because the methods themselves were wrong. In 1934, Ford established a second plantation called Belterra, located on higher ground approximately 30 miles from Fordlandia. The soil at Belterra was better, less acidic, more suited to cultivation. The terrain was flatter, more amenable to the orderly rows that plantation agriculture required. The site seemed more promising, and Ford committed additional millions to developing it. The same American methods were applied at Belterra. The same American houses were built with the same metal roofs that turned them into ovens. The same American rules were imposed, with the same prohibitions on alcohol and the same requirements for time clocks and identification badges. The same American assumptions were made about what workers needed and wanted and would accept. The same American failures resulted. The rubber trees at Belterra grew better than those at Fordlandia. The soil really was superior, but they still could not escape the leaf blight that made plantation rubber impossible in the Amazon. The fungus found the trees wherever they were planted, spreading through the humid air from leaf to leaf, defoliating groves that had taken years to establish, destroying the investment of time and money that each tree represented. The botanists and agronomists tried everything they could think of. They grafted disease-resistant rootstocks with high-yielding varieties. They adjusted spacing to reduce the spread of infection. They applied fungicides that had shown promise in laboratory conditions. Nothing worked at scale. The leaf blight was not a problem to be engineered away. It was an ecological reality that had evolved over millions of years, a natural check on rubber tree populations that could not be overcome by industrial methods. The workers at Belterra were marginally more compliant than those at Fordlandia. The memories of the riot and its aftermath encouraged caution, but they were no more enthusiastic about American rules, no more convinced that the American way was superior to their own. They worked because they were paid, not because they believed in the project. They followed the rules because they feared the consequences of resistance, not because they accepted the legitimacy of the rules. The social experiment that Ford had envisioned, the creation of an American-style community in the jungle, was a failure at Belterra, just as it had been at Fordlandia. Through the 1930s, Ford continued to pour money into his Brazilian operations. Accountants in Dearborn tallied the losses year after year, watching millions of dollars disappear into the jungle with nothing to show for them. The rubber that was produced, a few hundred tons annually at the peak, cost far more per pound than rubber purchased on the open market from the British plantations that Ford had been trying to escape. The dream of independence had become a financial nightmare, a sunk cost that kept demanding more investment to justify what had already been spent. World War II brought changes that rendered Fordlandia irrelevant even before its failure was officially acknowledged. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia in 1942 cut off the supply of plantation rubber that had made the Amazon uncompetitive. Suddenly, the British plantations in Malaya and the Dutch plantations in the East Indies were in enemy hands. The rubber that had flowed so freely to American factories was now unavailable, and the United States faced a critical shortage of a material essential to the war effort. For a moment, it seemed that Ford's investment might finally pay off. The Amazon rubber that had been too expensive to compete with Asian plantations was now the only natural rubber available to the Allied war machine. The Brazilian government launched a renewed effort to increase rubber production, recruiting thousands of tappers to work the wild trees that still grew scattered through the jungle. American money and American expertise poured into the Amazon, not to Ford's plantations but to the wild rubber operations that Ford had been trying to replace. But Fordlandia and Belterra contributed almost nothing to the war effort. The plantations that had absorbed $20 million produced only a few hundred tons of rubber per year, a trivial amount compared to the millions of tons that American industry required. The trees that should have been mature and productive were dead or stunted, killed by the leaf blight that no amount of money or expertise had been able to overcome. The investment that was supposed to guarantee American independence had produced only failure. The American government, desperate for rubber, did not wait for Fordlandia to succeed. Instead, it invested massively in synthetic rubber production, developing technologies that had been known for decades but never commercialized. By 1945, American factories were producing over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, more than enough to meet the needs of the war economy. The strategic vulnerability that had motivated Ford's Brazilian adventure had been solved, not by plantation agriculture, but by industrial chemistry. After the war, the writing was on the wall. Synthetic rubber would never replace natural rubber entirely. Some applications still required the properties that only natural rubber could provide. but it had broken the British monopoly more thoroughly than any plantation in Brazil could have done. The strategic rationale for Fordlandia had evaporated. The financial rationale had never existed. The only question was how to dispose of an investment that had consumed $20 million and produced almost nothing. In 1945, Henry Ford's grandson, Henry Ford II, who had taken over management of the company from his aging grandfather, decided to cut the company's losses. The Ford Motor Company sold its Brazilian holdings back to the Brazilian government for a nominal sum. Accounts vary, but the figure most commonly cited is $250,000, roughly 1% of what had been invested. The American managers packed their belongings and went home. The American equipment was left where it stood, too expensive to ship back and too specialized to sell. The American dream of taming the Amazon was officially, finally, irreversibly abandoned. The departure was quiet, almost furtive, as if the company was embarrassed by what had happened and wanted to minimize attention. There was no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement of failure, no public accounting of what had gone wrong. The managers who had spent years in the jungle simply left, returning to careers in Dearborn or elsewhere, carrying memories they rarely discussed. The workers who had labored under American rules were left to find new employment or new lives, their brief experience of Ford's vision already fading into memory. What remained was a ghost town in the making. The houses that Ford built still stood, but without maintenance they began immediately to decay. The tropical climate attacked everything. Wood rotted, metal rusted, paint peeled, roofs leaked. The jungle that had been cleared began to reclaim the land, vines and saplings sprouting in yards that had been kept trim by company groundskeepers, trees rising in fields that had been planted with rubber seedlings that never matured. But Fordlandia did not become entirely a ghost town. Some workers stayed, seeing opportunity in the infrastructure the Americans had left behind. The houses, even deteriorating, were better than what most Brazilians in the region could afford. The hospital, still equipped with American medical technology, was too valuable to abandon. The schools, the warehouses, the administrative buildings all represented investment that could be repurposed for Brazilian needs. A community formed in the ruins, Brazilian families moving into American houses, adapting the infrastructure to their own purposes. They were not trying to continue Ford's vision. They were simply making use of what had been left behind. They grew their own food in gardens where American lawn grass had once been maintained. They raised animals in yards that had been subject to inspection by the sociological department. They drank alcohol and practiced Catholicism and lived according to their own customs, finally free of the rules that Ford had imposed. The rubber trees that were supposed to justify everything gradually disappeared. Without the constant effort required to maintain them, the pruning, the fungicide applications, the replacement of diseased trees, the plantation succumbed to the leaf blight they had never been able to overcome. The orderly rows that had been planted with such care became indistinguishable from the surrounding jungle, the cultivated trees swallowed by wild growth, the investment of years erased by the relentless vitality of the Amazon. Today, Fordlandia is home to approximately 3,000 people, a small Brazilian town that happens to occupy the infrastructure of a failed American experiment. The residents go about their lives in buildings designed by engineers in Michigan, walking streets laid out according to American principles, living in a place whose history is more famous internationally than locally. The water tower still stands, its Ford lettering faded but still legible, a landmark visible above the jungle canopy. Tourists who make the difficult journey to Fordlandia photograph it as proof they have been there, as evidence of the strange history that brought American industrial ambition to this remote location. The tower has become a symbol, reproduced in books and documentaries about Ford's failure, about American arrogance, about the limits of industrial thinking. The hospital still operates, serving not just Fordlandia, but the surrounding region. It is one of the few medical facilities for hundreds of miles, a legacy of Ford's investment that continues to benefit people who never knew the man and never experienced his vision. Doctors and nurses work in buildings that were designed to serve a rubber plantation, treating patients whose lives are unconnected to the dreams that brought the hospital into existence. The houses still decay more rapidly each year. Some have been maintained by residents who have the resources to repair roofs and replace boards. Others have collapsed entirely, their walls fallen and their foundations exposed, monuments to the impermanence of everything that Ford tried to build. A few have been restored as historical curiosities, their American architecture preserved for visitors who want to see what Ford's vision looked like before the jungle reclaimed it. The jungle itself seems indifferent to the history. It grows where it always grew, following its own logic of competition and cooperation, predator and prey, sunlight and shadow. The rubber trees that Ford planted are gone, but wild rubber trees still grow, scattered through the forest, producing latex as they always have, resistant to the blight that destroyed their plantation cousins because they grow in the density that nature intended, rather than the rows that industry demanded. Tourists occasionally visit Fordlandia today, drawn by the strange history of the place, by the incongruity of American architecture in the Amazon jungle, by the story of how the richest man in the world was defeated by a fungus and a forest. The journey is not easy. Fordlandia is far from any major city, accessible only by boat or by rough roads that become impassable during the rainy season. But those who make the effort find a place that exists between worlds, neither fully Brazilian nor fully American, a hybrid created by failure. They photograph the water tower with its faded Ford lettering, the icon that appears in every documentary and every article about the place. They explore the rusting machinery in the abandoned industrial buildings, trying to imagine what it looked like when it was new, and workers were processing latex that was supposed to make Henry Ford independent of British rubber. They walk through houses that American families once occupied, seeing the tropical decay that has transformed Michigan architecture into something strange and melancholy. They talk to the residents if they can, asking questions about what life is like in Fordlandia, whether the history matters to the people who live there. The answers are usually polite but uninterested. The residents have their own concerns: work and family, health and education, the practical matters of daily life. The American history of their town is a curiosity to visitors but a backdrop to residents, something that explains why certain buildings exist but not something that shapes how they live. The answer to what Ford was thinking is both simple and complex. He was thinking what he always thought, that American methods were superior, that rational planning could solve any problem, that the world could be remade in the image of Dearborn, Michigan, if only sufficient resources were applied. He was thinking that rubber trees were a manufacturing input like steel or glass, to be produced efficiently through proper management, without regard for the biological and ecological complexities that made rubber cultivation in the Amazon fundamentally different from automobile assembly in Detroit. He was wrong. The jungle was not a factory floor. The workers were not interchangeable parts. The rubber trees were not machines that would produce on schedule if properly maintained. Everything Ford knew about manufacturing, everything that had made him successful, was useless in the Amazon, and he never understood why. The story of Fordlandia is often told as a parable of American arrogance, of the assumption that American ways are universally applicable, that what works in Michigan will work anywhere if the natives can just be made to cooperate. There is truth in this interpretation. Ford's disregard for local knowledge, his imposition of American customs on Brazilian workers, his refusal to adapt his methods to local conditions, all of these reflect an arrogance that has characterized American engagement with the world throughout history. The American managers who came to Fordlandia arrived with certainty and departed with confusion. They had been trained in the Ford system, had internalized the beliefs that made that system work, had never questioned the assumption that efficiency and standardization were universal goods. They applied what they knew, and when it failed, they could not understand why. The jungle was not supposed to resist. The workers were not supposed to rebel. The trees were not supposed to die. The Brazilian workers who rioted and resisted understood something the Americans never grasped: that knowledge is local, that what works in one place may fail in another, that the people who live somewhere usually know more about that place than the people who arrive with plans and money and certainty. The tappers who had harvested wild rubber for generations knew that trees planted in rows would die. The farmers who had worked the Amazonian soil knew that it could not support intensive cultivation. The families who had lived in the jungle knew that metal roofs would make houses uninhabitable and that prohibition would make workers resentful. Their knowledge was dismissed because it came from the wrong sources, because it was expressed in the wrong language, because it contradicted the assumptions that Ford's managers had brought from Michigan. The arrogance was not just national, but epistemological, a belief that certain kinds of knowledge were superior to others, that engineering trumped experience, that theory trumped practice, that American education trumped Brazilian wisdom. But the story is also about the limits of industrial thinking, about what happens when you treat biological systems as engineering problems, when you assume that nature can be controlled with the same precision as a manufacturing process. The assembly line works because every part is identical, because every step can be standardized, because variation is the enemy of efficiency. The jungle works on opposite principles. Diversity is strength, variation is survival, standardization is death. Henry Ford had built his fortune on the principle of interchangeability. Every Model T was identical to every other Model T. Every worker on the assembly line performed the same task as every other worker in that position. Every part was manufactured to tolerances that ensured it would fit with every other part. This standardization was the source of Ford's efficiency, the reason his cars could be produced cheaply enough for ordinary Americans to afford. But rubber trees are not Model T parts. They are living organisms with genetic variation, with individual responses to disease and drought and soil conditions, with needs that cannot be standardized. A plantation that treats trees as interchangeable units, planting them in rows, spacing them uniformly, expecting identical production from each, ignores the biological reality that makes each tree different from every other. The leaf blight that destroyed Fordlandia exploited exactly this standardization. In the wild, rubber trees grow scattered through the forest, separated by other species, their spacing determined by competition and chance rather than planning. The blight exists in this environment, but it cannot spread easily from tree to tree. The distance is too great, the obstacles too many. In a plantation, where trees stand in neat rows with nothing between them, the blight spreads like fire, jumping from leaf to leaf, from tree to tree, from row to row, until everything is dead. Ford tried to make the Amazon into a factory, and the Amazon refused. The leaf blight that destroyed his plantations was not a problem to be engineered away. It was a natural process that existed in balance with the wild rubber trees and could only be controlled by maintaining that balance. The neat rows of identical trees that made sense in an Asian plantation, where the disease did not exist, were suicide in the Amazon, where the disease had evolved alongside the trees and was waiting for exactly the concentration of hosts that plantation agriculture provided. The workers who rioted against American rules were not primitives who needed to be civilized. They were people with their own knowledge and their own values, who understood the jungle better than any manager from Michigan ever could. Their resistance was not backwardness but wisdom, not ingratitude but self-respect. They knew that the American way was not the only way, and they refused to pretend otherwise. They had seen other outsiders come to the Amazon with grand plans and confident expectations. They had watched those plans fail, had seen the jungle reclaim what outsiders had tried to build, had learned that the forest was patient and would outlast any human ambition. They brought this knowledge to their work at Fordlandia, and they were not surprised when Ford's plans failed as others had failed before. The legacy of Fordlandia extends beyond the rusting buildings on the Tapajós River. The failure of the project contributed to the development of synthetic rubber, which eventually freed the automobile industry from dependence on natural rubber entirely. If Ford had succeeded in the Amazon, if plantation rubber had proven viable in South America, the urgency that drove synthetic rubber development might have been reduced. In a sense, Ford's failure accelerated a technological transition that ultimately solved the problem he had been trying to solve through agriculture. The lessons of what went wrong, the importance of local knowledge, the limits of industrial methods in biological systems, the danger of imposing one culture on another, have been studied by scholars and applied to subsequent development projects with varying degrees of success. Fordlandia appears in business school case studies as an example of how not to manage an international operation. It appears in environmental studies as an example of the ecological limits of industrial agriculture. It appears in anthropology as an example of cultural imperialism and its consequences. But the most important legacy may be the reminder that wealth and power and certainty are not enough. Henry Ford was the richest man in the world, or close to it. He had unlimited resources, the best engineers money could buy, and absolute confidence in his own judgment. He still failed, completely and expensively, because he was trying to do something that could not be done the way he wanted to do it. The jungle did not care about Ford's wealth. The blight did not care about Ford's engineers. The workers did not care about Ford's confidence. They all responded to their own realities, followed their own logics, resisted in their own ways. No amount of money could change the biology of leaf blight. No amount of expertise could overcome the ecological unsuitability of plantation rubber in the Amazon. No amount of certainty could convince workers to accept rules they found oppressive and pointless. The jungle still stands along the Tapajos River. The water tower still rises above the trees, its Ford lettering fading but still visible, a monument to ambition that exceeded understanding. The houses still decay, the machinery still rusts, the rubber trees still refuse to grow in neat plantation rows. Henry Ford's jungle nightmare continues, a dream that became a ruin, a vision that became a warning. Fordlandia cost $20 million and produced almost nothing. A few barrels of latex, some interesting failures, and a story that continues to resonate nearly a century later. It is a story about America and about the limits of American power. It is a story about industry and about the limits of industrial thinking. It is a story about one man's certainty and about how certainty can become blindness when it refuses to learn from failure. The Amazon won. The jungle won. The fungus won. The workers who refused to conform to American rules won, in the sense that they outlasted the system that tried to control them. Henry Ford lost, and the Ford Motor Company lost, and the American dream of controlling the world's rubber supply lost. What remains is the ruin, the story, and the question that Fordlandia still asks. What makes us think we know better? What makes us think our way is the only way? What makes us think we can impose our vision on places and peoples who have their own visions, their own knowledge, their own ways of living that have worked for generations before we arrived with our certainty and our capital and our conviction that we know best? Fordlandia has no answer to these questions. It only asks them, standing in the jungle, rusting in the rain, waiting for the visitors who come to see what American ambition looks like when the jungle has finished with it. The water tower still says, Ford. The jungle still says otherwise. Henry Ford died in 1947, 2 years after his company abandoned Fordlandia. He was 83 years old, one of the most famous men in the world, the creator of the assembly line and the Model T and the $5 day. His obituaries praised his achievements and noted his failures, but few mentioned the town in the Amazon that bore his name, the $20 million that had vanished into the jungle, the dream that had become a nightmare. He never visited Fordlandia. In all the years that his money was being spent and his managers were struggling and his workers were rioting, Henry Ford never once traveled to Brazil to see what he had created. He made decisions based on reports and photographs and the assurances of employees who knew better than to tell him what he did not want to hear. He remained in Dearborn, in the world he understood, directing an operation in a world he had never seen and could not imagine. Perhaps if he had visited, he would have understood why his project was failing. Perhaps he would have seen the jungle for what it was, felt the heat that made his metal-roofed houses unbearable, smelled the humidity that rotted everything, watched the leaf blight spread through his carefully planted rows. Perhaps he would have listened to the workers who knew the jungle, learned from the tappers who understood rubber, adapted his methods to conditions he had not anticipated. Or perhaps not. Perhaps he would have seen what he expected to see, blamed the failures on incompetent managers or ungrateful workers, or bad luck, doubled down on his certainty that American methods would eventually prevail. Perhaps he was incapable of learning the lessons that Fordlandia had to teach, too committed to his own vision to see that the vision was wrong. We will never know. Henry Ford never went to Fordlandia, and Fordlandia went on without him, failing on its own schedule, collapsing under its own contradictions, becoming the ruin that it is today. The town still exists on maps, still appears in the GPS coordinates that guide occasional visitors to its location on the Tapajos. The people who live there still wake up in Ford's houses and send their children to Ford's schools and receive medical care in Ford's hospital. They have made a life in the ruins, adapted the infrastructure to their own purposes, created a community that Henry Ford never imagined and would probably not have approved. They are the final victors in the story of Fordlandia. Not Ford, who lost his money and his dream. Not the American managers who went home defeated. Not the jungle, which simply continued being what it always was. The people who stayed, who made something from the wreckage, who turned an American failure into a Brazilian home. They are the ones who won in the end. The water tower still stands above the canopy, visible for miles, a landmark that means different things to different people. To tourists and historians, it is a symbol of American overreach, proof of what happens when hubris meets reality. To the residents of Fordlandia, it is simply the water tower, a feature of their town that has always been there, that their parents and grandparents knew that will probably outlast them and their children. The Ford lettering is fading, the paint that once proclaimed ownership now barely visible against the rusted steel. Someday it will be gone entirely, and the tower will become just a tower, its history forgotten, except by those who study such things. The jungle is patient. It has already swallowed the rubber trees and the dreams they represented. Eventually, it will swallow everything else. Fordlandia. Population approximately 3,000. Location: Tapajos River. Pará State, Brazil. Founded: 1928. Abandoned by Ford: 1945. Investment: $20 million. Equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Rubber produced: almost nothing. Status: inhabited ruin, monument to American ambition, reminder of American limits, warning to anyone who believes that money and certainty are enough. The rubber never came. The dream never worked. The jungle never surrendered. But the town remains. The water tower remains. The story remains. Henry Ford's jungle nightmare. Still standing. Still rusting. Still asking questions that America has not yet learned to answer. If this story mattered to you, please consider subscribing. These investigations take time to research and produce, and your support makes them possible. Tell me in the comments, which forgotten American failure should we explore next? The company town that became a prison? The nuclear city that poisoned its workers? The perfect suburb that was built on poison? Every dream has a cost. Every ambition has a limit. Every certainty has a blindness. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.